which was with these track limits. And I've tweeted and been very vocal about my hatred of track limits and how I think it's one of the stupidest things that has ever been, created around motorsports. And, the only thing stupider is the sausage curb in areas where it's like it's supposed to be a runoff, and yet you hit this 3-foot curb that sends you into the shadow realm. My first and foremost, my issue of track limits and explaining what track limits are. Track limits are arbitrary position points on the racetrack that the stewards decide that you can only go so far into this area, whether it's a curb or a line or whatever, into a paved area before you get basically a penalty, a time penalty, or a reprimand for going that far out and basically making the track too wide. It makes absolute sense in terms of cutting corners. Of course, you don't want people cutting corners, but in terms of exits, to me, it makes zero sense. And my point being is, as motorsports has, tried to be safer and that sort of thing, we've paved a lot of areas that used to be gravel traps and grass because we discovered cars can generally slow down better on asphalt, and you don't get as hard hits into the wall, and in the rain it might be safer and that sort of stuff, right? And it doesn't catch on asphalt and start flipping all over the place, and so it's supposed to be safer, but because of that, it's changed the nature of the runoff of some of these racetracks where, there's a lot of room that could take a corner that wasn't flat out and suddenly make it flat out. To me, that is a feature, not a bug. That is modern racing. You add pavement to this area, the track has changed. We can use it. It fits within the parameters of the way to drive that racetrack as fast as possible. Then by all means, go ahead. We in NASCAR obviously go via that methodology, and when you look at races like COTA or the runoff of turn, the carousel at Watkins Glen, or anywhere that has runoff like that, we're going to use it and we're allowed to. And it's because they view it the way I do, which is, hey, you think you can use it to go faster? By all means, good luck. Now, if you're cutting the course, that's different. But if it's on the outside and you want to make the course longer, but that's faster, have fun. How in the world are you supposed to explain that to someone watching racing for the first time and be like, whoa, 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 you can't go over that line? Why? It's paved. It's just a line. Well, if you go over that, it's track limits. What is a track limit? Like, what? It doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't make any sense.
I want to look at this holistically for just a second, because I got into some Twitter debates, and I had my own tweet about track limits. I said that track limits were a design flaw in speedways, or in racetracks, just like chicanes, which I firmly believe that chicanes are a design flaw. But that's we can talk about that.
They're a bug.
They're a bug. So let's talk about track limits for just a second, because we say. And what I mean is, I want to define track limits. Because we keep saying track limits like it's a man-made thing, right? And I get what the version of track limits that you're saying. Yes, it's a man-made thing. But let's just start on one end of the spectrum, because to me, track limits is a spectrum, right?
Okay.
We're not going to start on the end of the spectrum that you're at, which is painted line track limits. We're going to start on the opposite end of the spectrum. And to me, and I want you to help me through this, okay? The opposite end of the spectrum from where you're at is really the limit of the race car. That's the first track limit that exists, right? No walls, no nothing. Just if your car, let's just say you were racing on a completely, paved skid pad, and you had to get from point A to point B. The limit would be what your car can handle to get from point A to point B in the shortest distance, right? Like that would be the original track limit. That's the OG track limit. Okay. I think the next track limit from there is a wall, right? Maybe I'm jumping too far ahead, but let's just say the next one is a wall. That's a pretty definitive track limit. Like, you can't go. I guess you can go through the wall. Some people go through. It's been done before.
I attempted it this weekend.
Go through the wall and keep racing. There's a pretty big penalty to that, right? So you can say the next track limit is a wall, is a barrier, a physical barrier that'll stop the car. And then you could go down another step of track limits and say, okay, we have after the wall, we have things like grass, right? Where we go from pavement to grass. That's a track limit because you go off the pavement into the grass, you're not going to be able to advance your position through the grass, although Dale Earnhardt did it once. There's
Well, he kind of kept
exceptions
his
to every.
position, but that's a whole nother point.
That's another debate. But there's exceptions to everything. Okay, so you have grass, you have a wall, you have the car is your ultimate track limit. You have the wall is a track limit. You have grass, you have maybe gravel, dirt, some kind of pavement ends, and then you have curbing, right? Maybe a little bit less intrusive or less penalty stricken like a wall or grass. You have curbing. So there's all different types of curbing. You may not see it if you've only ever watched races on TV. You see the curbs, but you may not realize that like sometimes those curbs have these channels in them that are inches wide and inches deep, right? And when you drive over them with the car, you actually lose traction, or the car bounces so much that you lose a lot of the harmonics. It like literally robs your car of acceleration, of horsepower, because you're driving over a rumble strip. Anybody that's driven a car on the highway has felt that, right? The rumble strips on a highway. So you have different types of curbing. Then you have like really aggressive curbing, which actually that might be above these, right? That's more closer to a wall type thing, the turtles and
I think we're getting a little in depth.
What's that? Yeah. All the way down.
Keep going,
We
but
went
a
through
little
curbings all the way down to painted lines, right? And then but the thing is, and this is the thing that we're talking about, like when you get to all those things are maybe man-made track limits, but they also are self-policing, right? Because you go off the track into the grass, you lose track, you lose the ability to advance. You crash into a wall, obviously you can't race anymore. You go over a curb, you lose traction, you lose ability to advance. But you get down to this point of painted line track limits, and now they're not self-policing anymore, right? They have to be policed by an official, by the race stewards. And that in itself is a flaw, because I feel like a proper racing series and a proper race director should not be and working with track designers, because I understand that racing series and race directors aren't always the ones that design tracks, but the purpose of a race director is not to make more rules for them to have to enforce. It sounds counterintuitive, but that's very wasteful in the whole process. If you're creating things that you then have to officiate, that don't self-police, then you're just making your life more difficult, and you're making the racing product depend more on you and not on the racing. Yep. And so, you can come to me with whatever opinion you want about, like, well, the drivers need to be able to race within painted lines. What's so difficult about that? Somebody on Twitter, a good friend of mine actually, was debating me pretty intensely about it. And he was like, well, how is it different than in football? Like, the field has to have lines and boundaries. And I mean, my argument to that is like, well, in football, if someone goes out of bounds, they stop the play. Right? They stop the play and they reset. That's part of the game. That's part of the game. And so in racing, we don't stop the play when someone goes out of bounds. We do if they like fully go out of the speedway, I guess.
Yeah.
But in a man-made, in terms of a man-made track limit, or this, whatever this version of man-made track limit we call it, a painted line track limit that requires officiating, you're not going to stop the race for every time someone goes out of bounds and reset the field, right? So you really just, as a sanctioning body or as a racetrack, you just created problems. You didn't solve them by having track limits, by having quote unquote painted line track limits. They're not helpful. And I guess they're maybe a byproduct right now of like, well, we're trying to do this for safety by having runoff, by having paved runoff. And I understand that, and I appreciate that as a driver. But there has to be a better solution, I guess. I don't know.
Has to be.
I don't know what
I think I appreciate the history lesson, and I do. I think it's important to bring all that up because that's how we ended up here. It's, to me, though, you summed it up well, which is it's inserting stewards and decision making and outside of the race influence into the results of a race, right? When motorsports can be far more pure than that, because you don't have to. There is no, I have my tweet, which is like there's only 3 things required for a motor race. It's a start line, a finish, or start point, finish point, and motor powered vehicles. Everything else is adjustable.